His name was not spoken yet. On the morning of June 4th, 1942, somewhere over the Central Pacific, 32 American dive bombers were running out of fuel and out of time, hunting for a Japanese carrier fleet that had already vanished from where the map said it should be. The men in those cockpits did not know it yet, but in the next few minutes, they were going to decide the outcome of the Second World War in the Pacific. They were flying an airplane that outside circles of naval aviators, almost nobody could name. It was not fast, it was not glamorous. Sailors would later give it a nickname that sounded almost like an insult: slow but deadly. The man who designed it had never worn a Navy uniform. He had never flown a single combat mission in his life. He had been fired from his first job in aviation within a year of taking it, a college dropout with no engineering degree, taught almost entirely from library books and other men's blueprints. And yet by that morning in June, his airplane was the single deadliest weapon the United States possessed anywhere on Earth. His name was Edward Henry Heinemann. Before we dive in, subscribe and tell me in one sentence where in the world you're watching from. I read every single comment. By the late 1930s, every serious aircraft manufacturer in America had quietly agreed on a ceiling. A dive bomber, they believed, could be fast, or it could be accurate, or it could survive a near-vertical dive without tearing itself apart, but it could not be all three in the same airframe. The problem was physical, and every engineer who studied it understood why. Push a biplane or a light monoplane into a 70-degree dive at full throttle, and turbulent air spilling off the wings began hammering the tail structure hard enough to shake a pilot's aim apart, sometimes hard enough to shake the airplane apart entirely. The safe answer, the one the United States Navy had already built its carrier air wings around, was the Vought SB-2U Vindicator, a competent, unspectacular monoplane that dove at a shallower, gentler angle specifically because its own manufacturer had concluded that anything steeper was asking for a structural failure at 300 miles an hour. Vought had done the math. Vought had built to the safer number. So had nearly everyone else with a contract to protect. One man looked at that same number and saw a door nobody else had bothered to check. His name was Edward Henry Heinemann. He was 18 years old. He had never designed so much as a wing rib. He had spent the first 2 decades of his life doing almost nothing that pointed toward airplanes at all. He was born on March 14, 1908 in Saginaw, Michigan, into a family with no money to spare and no engineers in it. While he was still a boy, the family moved west to California, and Heinemann grew up in Los Angeles in the years when the city itself was still deciding what it wanted to be. Oil derricks, orange groves, and increasingly, airfields, all crowded together on the same stretch of coastline. On his 8th birthday, someone gave him a toy biplane. He kept it. As a teenager, he took to hanging around the fence line at Ascot Park Speedway, watching men risk their necks in machines with wheels instead of wings, absorbing something about speed and structural failure that no classroom was teaching him. There was no tuition money behind him, no engineering faculty, no family connection into the aviation trade that was just then starting to boom 60 miles from his front door. What he had instead was persistence, a library card, and a habit of reading a blueprint the way other boys read comic books. He never earned an engineering degree. Not from Caltech, not from Stanford, not from anywhere. Everything he came to know about stress loads, airfoil sections, and structural weight he taught himself, one borrowed manual at a time, while men with framed diplomas on their office walls assumed the diplomas were the reason they were in those offices, and he was not. In 1926, at 18 years old, he talked his way into a drafting job at the Douglas Aircraft Company, the lowest rung on the ladder, tracing other men's designs onto vellum for a paycheck. Within a year, Douglas let him go. No dramatic reason, just a company trimming a payroll, and a teenage draftsman with no degree behind his name was the easiest man to cut. He did not go back to school. He went looking for the next drafting table. International Aircraft took him next, a small outfit with a short runway of its own kind of prospects. Then came Moreland Aircraft, where Heinemann was handed something closer to real authority, chief engineer, on a company barely large enough to need one, but a title is a title, and titles are how careers start climbing. At Moreland, he did something almost nobody in the industry did casually. When he finished a design, he strapped himself into it and flew it himself, testing his own theories about lift and stability in the air, in his own airplane, with his own body as the instrument. It was not glamorous work. Moreland built trainers, not fighters, and nobody in Washington was watching. But it was proof, on paper and in the air, that the 18-year-old who'd been let go from Douglas without a second thought had learned to design an airplane that flew the way he said it would. In 1930, Northrop Aircraft Corporation hired him as a project engineer, and for the first time, Heinemann was working inside a company building airplanes that mattered. Airplanes the Navy and the Army were actually paying attention to. It would take 8 more years, one corporate buyout, and a war already gathering in Europe before the name Heinemann meant anything outside a handful of drafting rooms in Southern California. But the early act of nerve was already there, buried in the record for anyone who looked. A fired draftsman with no degree who had gone out and built and flown his own airplanes rather than wait for someone with a diploma to hand him permission. In 1934, the United States Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics put out a call that most established aircraft companies treated as routine business, a request for proposals on a new carrier-based dive bomber. Heinemann was 26 years old, still working under John Northrop's name, with nothing on his resume larger than a training aircraft. He submitted a design anyway. The technical problem the Navy needed solved was not exotic on paper. Build a 2-seat scout bomber that could dive steeply, survive a carrier landing, and carry a 500-pound bomb further than anything currently in service. What made it hard was that nobody had yet built an airframe light enough to do all three without breaking apart in the dive or running out of fuel on the way home. Heinemann's answer, submitted against established competition, won the contract. The Navy ordered a single prototype, designated the XBT-1, and in that decision revealed the design instinct that would define the rest of his career. Take the most powerful engine currently available, strip every unnecessary pound off the airframe around it, and refuse to add weight for anything that didn't directly serve speed, range, or survivability. It was not an elegant philosophy. It was a brutally simple one, and it worked. The BT-1 itself was flawed, underpowered, difficult to handle, hardly the machine of legend. But Heinemann didn't abandon it. He kept refining it, engine by engine, airframe modification by airframe modification, through a second prototype the Navy ordered in 1937, the XBT-2. That same year, Douglas Aircraft absorbed the Northrop operation outright, and the small division at El Segundo, California, the men, the drafting tables, the half-finished dive bomber project, became a part of Donald Douglas's company. Heinemann came with it. By 1936, he had already risen to chief engineer over the Northrop design team. Now, inside Douglas, that authority carried straight through into the division that would soon bear the company's name. The door that opened in 1934 with a Navy request for proposals never closed again. Every airplane Heinemann would design for the next 37 years, dive bombers, attack jets, supersonic research aircraft, traced its design philosophy back to that first contract, the most engine the airframe could survive and nothing extra riding along for the flight. On May 1, 1940, at the Douglas plant in El Segundo, California, a stubby single-engine monoplane with a distinctive perforated tail section lifted off on its first flight as the SBD-1, Experimental Scout Bomber Douglas. It did not look like a breakthrough, it looked, if anything, almost awkward. A thick barrel-shaped fuselage, a fixed and heavily fared landing gear, wings that seemed too small for the airplane hanging beneath them. The breakthrough was not in the shape. It was in 2 long slotted panels built into the trailing edge of each wing, split dive flaps, hinged panels above and below the wing's trailing edge that opened outward during a dive to act as air brakes, holding the aircraft to a controlled stable speed instead of letting it accelerate uncontrollably toward the ground. Other manufacturers had tried flaps like these before. What made Heinemann's version different was almost absurdly simple. He drilled them full of holes. Dozens of round perforations across each panel, arranged in careful rows. Engineers who saw the drawings before the flaps were tested assumed the holes would weaken the structure for no benefit. What the holes actually did was let a controlled amount of air bleed straight through the flap instead of piling up behind it and boiling into the violent, buffeting turbulence that had been shaking the tail sections off steep diving aircraft for a decade. Bleed the pressure through in small, steady streams, and the turbulence that used to hammer a pilot's aim apart simply never built up in the first place. It sounded almost too easy. It worked exactly as advertised. a dive bomber that could hold a near-vertical 70-degree dive at a steady, predictable speed all the way down, with a pilot who could actually see his target through the sight the entire time instead of fighting the airplane to keep it pointed anywhere close to straight. The establishment's reaction was not outright dismissal. The Navy had, after all, funded the program and placed an order, but acceptance came with a hard qualifier attached. The Bureau of Aeronautics looked at the new SBD-1 and concluded, on paper and in testing, that it was not yet combat ready. The objection was coherent, not a straw man: fuel capacity. A carrier dive bomber spent long stretches of every mission circling to form up with its squadron and circling again to land, and the SBD-1's tanks simply didn't hold enough gasoline to make that math work safely over open ocean, thousands of miles from the nearest airfield. It was a legitimate engineering complaint from officers who had watched aircraft run dry over water before and had no intention of watching it happen again. Douglas agreed to fix it, committing to increase the internal fuel capacity starting with the 58th production airframe, an admission built directly into the production line that the establishment's caution had been earned. What the dive flaps proved, even before the fuel problem was solved, came down to three things no earlier American dive bomber design had delivered together. First, a pilot could hold a steep near-vertical dive angle all the way to bomb release without the tail buffeting hard enough to throw his aim off. Accuracy that shallow diving designs like the Vindicator had sacrificed by design, and steep diving designs without perforated flaps had sacrificed to structural stress. Second, the airframe could absorb the aerodynamic loads of that same dive after dive, mission after mission, without the fatigue cracking that had ended the service lives of less rugged competitors. Third, and this was the one nobody in 1940 fully appreciated yet, the same stability that made the dive accurate also made the airplane forgiving enough for an average carrier pilot, not just a handful of exceptional ones, to fly it well under combat stress. A weapon that only worked in the hands of your best pilots was a fragile weapon. A weapon that worked in the hands of your average ones was a fleet-wide asset. None of it looked like history in the making on a runway in El Segundo in the spring of 1940. It looked like a squat, unglamorous airplane with holes drilled in its wings, being cautiously approved by officers who still weren't sure it was ready for the fight. Everyone in the room could feel coming. The people signing off on it that spring, with their qualifiers and their fuel tank stipulations, did not yet know they were looking at the machine that would sink 4 aircraft carriers in a single afternoon 2 years later. By the time the production line at El Segundo and the second Douglas plant in Tulsa, Oklahoma finally wound down in 1944, close to 5,900 Dauntlesses had rolled off the 2 assembly lines combined. The United States Navy flew it as its primary carrier-based scout and dive bomber from mid-1940 onward. The United States Marine Corps flew it from island airstrips and from carrier decks alike. The Army Air Forces took a land-based variant without a tailhook, designated the A-24 Banshee, into training and second-line combat roles. Even the Free French Air Forces eventually put SBDs into service, a design born in a small California drafting room, finding its way onto 4 different national air arms before the war was finished. The airplane's first real proof of concept in combat came in May of 1942 in the Coral Sea, north of Australia, the first naval battle in history fought entirely between opposing aircraft carriers, with the 2 fleets never coming within sight of each other. SBDs from the Yorktown and Lexington helped sink the light carrier Shoho outright and put damage into the fleet carrier Shokaku, severe enough to keep her out of the next major engagement by a matter of weeks. It was a tactical draw on paper. It was the first time in the history of naval warfare that a battle had been decided purely by carrier aircraft, and the Dauntless had been one of the 2 aircraft types that decided it. Even as the SBD was proving itself in the Coral Sea, Curtiss Wright was already deep into development of its intended successor, a larger, faster, more heavily armed dive bomber designated the SB-2C Helldiver, built specifically to replace the Dauntless on fleet carrier decks. On paper, the Helldiver was simply the better airplane, 40 miles an hour faster, a bigger bomb bay, heavier defensive armament. The Navy had every reason to expect the newer design would render the smaller, slower SBD obsolete within a year or 2 of its combat debut. Nobody in early 1942, knew that the airplane already scheduled for retirement was about to deliver the single most decisive few minutes of the entire Pacific War. You are flying an SBD-3 at 9,000 feet over the Central Pacific, and it is a little past 10 o'clock in the morning on June 4th, 1942. Your squadron has been in the air for almost 2 hours, chasing coordinates that turned out to be empty ocean, and your fuel gauge is telling you a story you don't want to hear. Then, below and ahead, you see it. Wakes cutting white lines across blue water, and above them, unmistakably, flight decks. 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, and their decks are crowded, fuel hoses still uncoiled, bombs and torpedoes stacked in the open where deck crews are scrambling to rearm and respot aircraft for their own strike. The fighter cover that should be up here waiting for you is nowhere in sight. It's down at wave-top height, finishing off the American torpedo bombers that just got slaughtered trying to draw exactly this opening. You roll into your dive. The world tips 90 degrees and the ocean fills your windscreen. Your dive flaps bite into the air, holding you steady at a speed you can actually aim through. You watch your target grow in the sight, a Japanese fleet carrier with everything flammable in the Pacific sitting exposed on her deck, and you release. In roughly 5 minutes, dive bombers from the Enterprise and the Yorktown, Bombing 6, Scouting 6, and Bombing 3, 30-plus SBDs in total, put fatal hits into 3 Japanese fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu. A 4th, Hiryu, would burn before the day was finished. Lieutenant Richard Best, breaking away from a communication mix-up that had sent 2 full squadrons at the same target, redirected his own 3-plane section at the last possible second onto Akagi and put his bomb through her flight deck into the hangar below, igniting the aircraft and ordnance packed there. It was the single costliest few minutes of the war for the Imperial Japanese Navy, and it had been delivered by an airplane the Navy's own procurement office was already planning to replace. The victory at Midway did nothing to change that plan. If anything, it bought the Helldiver program more time, not less. The Navy had committed to the newer, faster design, and a single spectacular afternoon over the Central Pacific was not going to reverse on a procurement decision already moving through the pipeline. Curtiss Wright kept building. The SBD kept flying, kept fighting, kept proving itself in action after action through the rest of 1942 and into 1943, and kept losing ground, contract by contract, to the airplane that was supposed to make it obsolete. Major Lofton R. Henderson was 39 years old, a 1926 graduate of the Naval Academy at Annapolis and the commanding officer of Marine Scout Bombing Squadron 241, VMS B-241, stationed on Midway Atoll itself when the Japanese fleet approached on June 4, 1942. At 6:05 that morning, Henderson's squadron got the order to scramble. He led 16 SBD-2 Dauntlesses off the atoll's runway toward the same Japanese carrier force that Wade McCluskey's Enterprise squadrons would find and devastate a few hours later. Except Henderson's men arrived first, and arrived without fighter escort, into a sky that still had its full complement of Japanese combat air patrol overhead. Many of his pilots were green, some barely weeks out of flight school, flying into their first combat mission against an enemy fleet at full readiness. Henderson made the tactical decision to attack in a shallow glide bombing run rather than a steep dive, a call some historians have since debated, but that reflected the inexperience of the pilots he was leading into action. As his formation descended toward the carriers, Japanese Zero fighters fell on them from above. Henderson's aircraft was hit early in the attack. Witnesses in the surviving formation reported that it was apparent from how his plane was flying that he had been struck and was no longer in control. He went down over open ocean. Only 8 of the 16 SBDs that took off with him made it back to Midway. Henderson's body was never recovered. To this day, his official status remains missing in action. He never received the medal in person. The Navy Cross was awarded posthumously for extraordinary heroism in leading his squadron directly at the Japanese carrier force, despite the absence of fighter cover. A citation read into the record for a man whose remains lie somewhere in the Pacific unmarked. 2 months later, when United States Marines seized a half-finished Japanese airstrip on the island of Guadalcanal, they gave it a name, Henderson Field. It would become one of the most fought-over pieces of ground in the entire Pacific War, the airbase that anchored 6 months of brutal combat as American and Japanese forces threw everything they had at controlling it. The man whose name it carried had been dead before the airfield was even captured, killed leading Green pilots into a fight. The surviving veterans of that same morning would go on to win a few hours later in the very same battle over the very same fleet. The power that moved against the Dauntless carried no single villain's name. It came from the U.S. Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics, WWII, the office in Washington responsible for deciding which aircraft the fleet would fly and which would be phased out, and its decision had been made years before Midway ever happened. As early as 1939, WWII had already committed to the Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver as the SBD's designated successor, a larger, faster, more heavily armed aircraft built to a specification the Dauntless, by its very design philosophy of lightness and simplicity, could never match on paper. The stated official reason was straightforward and on its face entirely reasonable. The SB-2C could fly 40 miles an hour faster and haul a heavier bomb load than the airplane it was replacing. Bigger numbers, newer airplane. The kind of decision that looked unassailable in a procurement memo. What the memo didn't capture, and what the fleet learned the hard way, was that the Helldiver arrived broken. Its prototype crashed twice before it ever reached production. First in February of 1941, when its engine failed on approach, and again that December, when the entire right wing tore away from the fuselage during a high-speed dive, the test pilot parachuting clear only, seconds before the wreckage hit the ground. Delivery of the first production aircraft slipped to June of 1942, more than a year behind schedule. Even then, the problems didn't stop. In January of 1943, a production SB-2C-1 suffered the same kind of structural failure during a dive test, and this time, the pilot did not survive. When Helldivers finally reached Essex-class carriers in December of 1942, fleet commanders judged them unfit for combat on site. The Royal Navy and the Royal Australian Air Force, both of whom had placed substantial orders, cancelled them outright rather than accept the airplane. By 1943, the failures had grown too large for Washington to ignore quietly. The Senate Committee investigating wartime production waste, chaired by Missouri Senator Harry Truman, opened an inquiry into the Helldiver program and returned a verdict that stunned Curtiss Wright's leadership. The company, Truman's committee found, had not succeeded in producing a single SB-2C fit for combat. Curtiss was forced to replace the plant manager at its Columbus, Ohio production line under direct pressure from the committee, and the company had to open an entirely separate post-production facility, just to repair the defects already built into airframes sitting on the tarmac. It was one of the harshest official rebukes issued to any American aircraft manufacturer during the entire war, and it changed nothing about WWII's underlying decision. The SB-2C was still the future. The SBD was still scheduled for retirement. Heinemann never publicly fought that decision. There is no documented record of him lobbying Washington to keep the Dauntless in frontline service, no dramatic confrontation with an admiral across a desk. What he did instead was quieter, and in its own way more consequential. In June of 1941, the Navy had issued a new requirement, not to save the SBD, but to replace both it and the still unproven Helldiver at once, with a single design that could outfly them both. Heinemann's team won that contract too, producing the XSB-2D-1, which flew faster than the Helldiver on its first test flight in April of 1943. But when the Navy pushed for a heavier single-seat production version, designated the BTD destroyer, Heinemann watched the added weight and complexity drag the airplane's performance backward, mile by mile, exactly the kind of bloat his entire career had been built on refusing to accept. So he did something almost no chief engineer does to his own program. In June of 1944, with a Navy contract already signed and production underway, Heinemann personally asked WWII to cancel the BTD. In its place, he proposed something built from nothing. According to the account that circulated afterward inside Douglas, Heinemann and two of his engineers spent a single overnight session in a Washington hotel room redrawing the entire aircraft from a blank sheet, a single-engine, single-seat attack bomber stripped of everything the BTD had accumulated. His team then went further than the redesign itself demanded, running a weight reduction program on every component of the new airframe, simplifying the fuel system alone, saved 270 pounds. Dropping the internal bomb bay for external hardpoints saved 200 more. An older, simpler tailwheel arrangement saved another 100. By the time the prototype was finished, Heinemann's team had cut more than 1,800 pounds from the original design, weight that became range, climb rate, and combat radius instead. That aircraft became the XBT-2D1. It flew in March of 1945, less than a year after Heinemann had killed his own production contract to build it, and it entered service as the AD Skyraider, later redesignated the A-1, one of the most durable attack aircraft the United States Navy would ever operate. The cost of the Bureau's original refusal to trust the SBD's design philosophy is not hard to quantify. More than a year of delay between the Helldiver's planned service entry and its actual combat debut. At least one dead test pilot in a structural failure. The SBD's own drilled dive flaps had been engineered specifically to prevent a decade earlier. A congressional investigation that named a major American aircraft manufacturer as having failed to deliver a single combat-worthy airplane, and a fleet that, even after the Helldiver finally reached frontline squadrons in November of 1943, kept quietly preferring the older, smaller, obsolete Dauntless whenever the choice was theirs to make. There was no dramatic firing, no forced resignation, no single afternoon when Heinemann's career came apart. What happened to him was quieter and, in its own way, more thorough. The airplane that made him a decisive figure in American military history simply stopped being the one anyone remembered. By the middle of 1944, the SBD was gone from the decks of the Navy's fleet carriers, pulled from frontline service, and handed down to training squadrons and to the Marine Corps, which kept flying it in combat through the Philippines campaign because nobody had told the Marines to stop. The official record was tidy about why. The SB-2C Helldiver had matured into a faster, harder-hitting airplane, and the fleet had moved on to something better, exactly as the Bureau of Aeronautics had planned back in 1939. That was the story that made it into the procurement summaries and the post-war unit histories. The real story, told by the men who actually strapped into both airplanes, ran differently. Lieutenant Commander James Vose, who commanded a Helldiver squadron in combat over Rabaul, said flatly that apart from folding wings, the SB-2C offered little improvement on the Dauntless it replaced, and that if given the choice, he'd take the SBD. He was not alone. Across the fleet, aircrews kept describing the newer, faster, officially superior airplane as harder to land, less forgiving, and less trustworthy than the obsolete design it was retiring. None of that sentiment changed the production schedule. The SBD's own numbers were never allowed to argue on its own behalf in front of the people who set procurement policy. What eroded fastest wasn't the airplane's reputation among the men who'd flown it, that stayed intact and grew for the rest of their lives. What eroded was the connection between the machine and the man who built it. The airplane wasn't named for Heinemann. It never had been. It carried the name Dauntless, a company convention going back to every Douglas aircraft that started with the letter D, and there was nothing in that name or in the history books that followed that pointed a casual reader back toward the engineer at El Segundo who had drilled holes in a set of dive flaps and solved a problem the entire industry had accepted as unsolvable. The pilots got names in the histories: McCluskey, Best, Henderson. The battle got a name. The airplane, in the broad public memory that formed around Midway in the decades after the war, became a supporting character in someone else's story, and the man who designed it became, if he appeared at all, a footnote below the footnote. Heinemann himself never collapsed under any of this, and there is no record that he spent much time resenting it. He simply kept working, through the A-20 and A-26 bombers, through the failed BTD and the redesign that became the Skyraider, through jets, through supersonic research aircraft, through 3 more decades at Douglas and then at General Dynamics, where in his 60s he helped oversee the early development of the F-16. He was not a man erased from the aviation industry. He was, by any professional measure, one of the most honored engineers in American military aviation history, eventually receiving the National Medal of Science in 1983. What he was erased from was the specific, singular moment that a public audience remembers, the 5 minutes over Midway that changed the Pacific War, which belongs in popular memory to pilots, to an admiral's gamble, to a battle, and almost never to the drafting table in El Segundo, where the airplane that made all of it possible had been designed, over and over, by a collegeless kid the Douglas Aircraft Company had once fired without a second thought. He died on November 26, 1991, at 83 years old. One of the most decorated aircraft designers the United States ever produced, and one of the least publicly known. Long after Heinemann's drafting table had moved on to other designs, the Dauntless kept fighting a war that had already outgrown the man who built it. At Guadalcanal from August of 1942 onward, SBDs flying out of the captured airstrip that would soon carry Lofton Henderson's name became the backbone of what pilots called the Cactus Air Force, a scratch collection of Navy, Marine, and Army aircraft holding the island against 6 months of Japanese counterattack. Marine and Navy Dauntlesses flew from Henderson Field, day after day, hunting Japanese transport and resupply convoys down the stretch of water between the islands that aircrews nicknamed the Slot, sinking troopships and cargo vessels before they could land reinforcements. It was grinding, unglamorous work, flown by exhausted crews off a strip that was itself under nightly bombardment, and it was every bit as decisive to the outcome of the Pacific War as the 5 minutes over Midway that made the airplane famous. 2 years later, in June of 1944, the Battle of the Philippine Sea gave the SBD its last major fleet action as a frontline carrier bomber, part of a long-range strike at the extreme edge of American range against a retreating Japanese fleet. By then the Navy had already begun formally replacing the Dauntless with the Helldiver on its fleet carrier decks, and the Philippine Sea marked something close to a closing chapter for the airplane in that specific role. Even as Marine squadrons kept flying SBDs in combat straight through the Philippines campaign because nobody higher up saw a pressing need to pull them out of a fight they were still winning. The airplane's reach went beyond the Pacific entirely. In November of 1942, SBDs flying off the USS Ranger supported Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa, the Dauntless's only combat action against a European Axis power. 11 months after that, in October of 1943, Ranger's SBDs struck German shipping off the Norwegian port of Bodo during Operation Leader, a raid that took the airplane designed for the Central Pacific and dropped it into the fjords of occupied Norway. By most tallies compiled after the war, and credited by naval historians including Barrett Tillman, the Dauntless ended up sinking more Japanese shipping tonnage than any other single Allied aircraft type of the entire war. More than 300,000 tons, including 6 aircraft carriers and 14 cruisers among its confirmed kills. Some of those figures remain disputed at the margins between different aircraft types, but no serious account of the Pacific Air War leaves the Dauntless off the shortlist. By the time that final tally was being compiled after 1945, Heinemann himself was nowhere near any of it. He had moved on from the SBD program years earlier, absorbed first in the failed BTD destroyer, and then, from July of 1944 onward, in the overnight redesign that became the Sky Raider, an airplane built explicitly to replace both the Dauntless and the Helldiver at once. The man who drilled the holes in the dive flaps that made the Midway attack possible was, by the time the history books started being written about that battle, 3 design generations removed from the airplane that carried his name into it. And when the public credit for the Pacific War's turning point did get assigned, it went almost entirely to other names. Wade McCluskey's gamble to follow a Japanese destroyer's wake back to the fleet became the textbook story of Midway. Dick Best's split-second decision to redirect his section onto Akagi became the textbook story of Midway. The battle itself, and the admirals who planned it, became the textbook story of Midway. The airplane that made all 3 of those human decisions matter. The machine stable enough for an average pilot to hold a lethal dive, rugged enough to absorb the damage and fly home, rarely rated more than a supporting mention, a make and model attached to somebody else's moment of glory. The company that built it fared better than the man, at least on paper. Douglas Aircraft kept growing through the post-war decades, its El Segundo division producing the Sky Raider, the Skyhawk, and a long line of Heinemann-designed successors well into the 1960s. In 1967, Douglas merged with McDonnell Aircraft to form McDonnell Douglas, and in 1997 that company was itself absorbed into Boeing. The corporate lineage of the plant, where a fired draftsman with no engineering degree once drilled test holes in a set of dive flaps, eventually folding into one of the largest aerospace manufacturers on Earth. The name Douglas disappeared from the letterhead. The airplane the company was best remembered for kept flying in museums and air shows into the 21st century, still called by the name it earned in 1940, still rarely paired in the public mind with the man who'd actually drawn it. The corporate lineage of what Heinemann built runs in a straight, traceable line to names a modern viewer already knows. Douglas Aircraft, the company that fired an 18-year-old draftsman in 1927 and then spent the next 4 decades building his designs, merged with McDonnell Aircraft in 1967 to form McDonnell Douglas, a company that went on to build fighters flown by air forces around the world. In 1997, McDonnell Douglas was itself absorbed into the Boeing company, and the name Douglas disappeared from the letterhead entirely, folded into one of the 2 largest aerospace manufacturers on Earth. Heinemann's own path ran in parallel and then diverged from it. In 1962, he left Douglas for General Dynamics, taking the title of Corporate Vice President of Engineering, and in that role he helped oversee the early development of a jet fighter that would become one of the most produced combat aircraft in history, the F-16. He retired in 1973, and a decade later, in 1983, received the National Medal of Science, one of the highest honors the United States government gives a scientist or engineer, awarded to a man who had never finished a college degree. But the story that best captures what the Dauntless actually was has nothing to do with mergers or medals. It happened on the airplane's very first day of the war, 6 months before Midway, and almost nobody outside naval history circles has ever heard it. On the morning of December 7, 1941, 18 SBDs took off from the USS Enterprise, roughly 200 miles west of Oahu, on a routine scouting flight ahead of the carrier's return to Pearl Harbor. They were unarmed for combat, configured for reconnaissance, flying in loose pairs toward what every one of those pilots expected to be an ordinary Sunday landing. They had no idea the Japanese strike force was already inbound behind them. As the SBDs approached Oahu, they flew straight into the middle of the attack, arriving over a harbor already burning, already under fire, with Japanese Zero fighters still working the sky and American anti-aircraft gunners on the ground, primed and terrified, firing at anything that moved. Lieutenant Clarence Dickinson and his wingman, Ensign John McCarthy, were both shot down that morning, not clearly by one enemy alone, but caught in a chaos of Japanese fighters and jumpy American gun crews who couldn't yet tell friend from enemy in the smoke. Dickinson survived, bailed out, and made it back to shore. 3 days later, hunting for some way to answer what he'd just watched happen to his own carrier's home base, he found and helped sink the Japanese submarine I-70, the first confirmed U.S. Navy kill of the entire Pacific War, flown in the same model of airplane that had nearly killed him days before. The Dauntless entered the Second World War not in triumph, but getting shot at by both sides simultaneously over its own home port. 6 months later, the same airplane, flown by different men in different squadrons, delivered the single most decisive blow of the entire naval war. Between those 2 mornings sits the whole story of what slow but deadly actually meant. There is one more chapter to that story, and it belongs to a different airplane entirely. When Heinemann killed his own BTD program in 1944, rather than send a compromised design into production, what he built to replace it, the XBT-2D1, redrawn overnight in a Washington hotel room, became the Douglas A-1 Skyraider, the aircraft that would go on to fly in Korea and Vietnam for a combined 2 decades of continuous American combat service. Same engineer, same refusal to accept a heavier, slower answer when a lighter one was still possible. A different airplane carrying the same signature into a different war. Heinemann got the physics right and the recognition wrong in almost exactly equal measure. He solved a problem that had stumped every major manufacturer in American aviation: how to make a dive bomber stable enough for an ordinary pilot to fly it accurately under fire with a set of drilled holes in a slab of aluminum that cost almost nothing and changed the outcome of a war. He never got the credit that the pilots who flew his airplane received, and there is no evidence he ever much minded that trade. They took his name off the fuselage. They could not take the 5 minutes over Midway that his airplane made possible. The next time you see that stubby, unglamorous silhouette in an old photograph, Nose down, dive flaps open, holding a line nothing else in the sky could hold. Think about a name that history very nearly let go entirely. And if you want to meet the airplane this same restless engineer built next, when the Navy handed him one more impossible number to solve, the story of the Sky Raider is waiting for you on your screen right now.